Into the Pass, a Donner Party Chronicle. They say the mountains remember. When the wind scrapes across the frozen pass, I sometimes hear them, whispers in the snow, like the murmur of voices lost long ago. I was a child then, no more than 8 winters old, and yet those months have never left me. They live behind my eyes, surfacing in dreams, in silence, in the crunch of footsteps through deep snow. When we stepped out of the Sierra that spring, we were not the same as when we entered. Some did not step out at all. Others left pieces of themselves buried beneath the drifts, souls, hopes, kin. The sun was warm again, but it could not thaw what winter had claimed. The rescue parties found more bones than bodies, more silence than sound. I remember the way the light looked when it first spilled over the ridgeline that morning, golden and indifferent. It had no pity for us, nor did it offer comfort. It was simply there, as it had always been, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something that changed us all. My name does not matter, not anymore. The newspapers gave us names. The world called us survivors. Some called us cannibals. But we were none of those things. Not really. We were just people who kept walking until we couldn't. We were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, drawn by the same thread that pulls at every soul, the need to believe in something better. The mountains do not lie. They do not yield. They only take. And they took from us more than I can say, more than I dare to remember. But I will try. Because the dead deserve to be remembered. Because the truth, what little of it remains, deserves its voice. This is the story of how we came to that place, and how we left it behind, piece by bitter piece. Illinois, April 1846. The fields were greening when the wagons rolled from Springfield. Birds trilled overhead, and the scent of rain clung to the breeze, promising life, change, hope. Our wagons were heavy with tools, flour, books, seeds, dreams tucked into canvas and oak. We carried heirlooms and memories, hopes packed next to dried apples, and letters from kin we might never see again. Father walked beside our oxen, his wide-brimmed hat low against the sun. His hands, calloused and strong, gripped the yoke straps as though the very weight of our future depended on his grip. Mother sat upright on the driver's bench, hands steady on the reins, though I saw her eyes flick again and again to the east, toward what we were leaving. A clapboard house shaded by oak trees, a grave we had no time to tend. George Donner and James Reed led the way, their confidence unshaken. They said California was Eden, and we believed them. Land for the taking, a new start. No more debts, no more crowded towns. A place where a man could build a legacy, and children could grow wild and free. Their talk lit fires in the hearts of men and pulled women along in its glow, even when fear clung to their skirts. There were dozens of us at first, families with names I would come to know by heart. The Breens, the Graves, the Murphys, the Kesebergs. Some were farmers, others merchants or carpenters. A few carried books and Bibles, others packed rifles and quiet suspicions. We were strangers bound by a shared dream, a thread of hope that stretched westward, shimmering under the sun. The journey began with laughter. I remember the songs. We sang as we moved, voices rising over the creak of wheels and the grunt of beasts. Songs of rivers and gold, of mountain valleys, and homes not yet built. Children ran beside the wagons, chasing butterflies and daring each other to leap over the ruts. Mothers swapped stories over campfires. Fathers traded news, whiskey, and ambition. Evenings brought the smell of bacon, the hiss of boiling coffee, the low murmur of prayer. We told ourselves the hard part was behind us, that the worst we'd endure was behind the reins or under the wheels. But we didn't know the land. Not truly. We didn't understand what it meant to travel hundreds of miles by foot, to trust our lives to maps and men we had never met. We did not yet know the price of the promise, but we would. We would come to know it in full. May 1846. The first wagons gathered like cattle before a storm, drawn together by rumor and resolve, clattering across muddy roads and swollen rivers to the agreed meeting point in Independence, Missouri. Spring rains left the prairies soaked, but it did not dampen the determination of the families who came. Our family joined them in late May. The Reeds, the Donners, the Graves family, the Breens, and others. We did not yet know how closely our fates would bind. For now, we were strangers, united by ambition. The promise of California, whispered in letters and sermons, loomed like Eden in our minds. At the center stood James F. Reed, a tall, dignified man with eyes like storm clouds. He wore his military past like armor, but it was his ambition that gleamed sharper than any blade. "We make our own fortune," he told my father one evening, around the communal fire. "No one hands us destiny. We take it, mile by mile." Father nodded cautiously. "But what if the land won't give it?" Reed smiled thinly. "Then we make the land yield." George Donner, the older of the two brothers, carried himself with quiet gravity. His younger brother Jacob was affable and restless, forever tinkering with the oxen harness or adjusting canvas. Their wives were sturdy, practical women, Tamsin Donner especially, with her sharp eyes and educated tongue. She kept a journal, carefully inked each night, even as the prairie winds threatened to tear the pages away. Children darted between wagons, chasing dogs and lifting pebbles from the dust like they were gold. My little sister, Rachel, made fast friends with Patty Reed. Their laughter was constant, like bird song, rising above the clamor of repairs and meal preparation. Our company grew daily. Blacksmiths and seamstresses, carpenters and former soldiers, widows and dreamers. Some drove rickety wagons held together with pitch and hope. Others, like Reed's Pioneer Palace car, were outfitted luxuriously with spring beds and brass-trimmed cabinetry. A final meeting was held under a setting sun where plans were confirmed and oaths made. We'd follow the established Oregon Trail to Fort Bridger, then consider a shortcut promoted by a man named Lansford Hastings, an alternate route that would shave weeks off the journey. None of us knew the truth. Hastings had never taken the route himself. "Trust me," said Reed, addressing the gathered group. "This is the new path of empire. California will reward the bold." There were murmurs of doubt, but few openly challenged him. It was spring. The grass was high. Spirits were higher. And so we began. July 1846. The trail wound across the plains, dry and slow, then climbed into the Rockies with a slow determination. The wagons groaned. The oxen struggled. But so far, the land had not broken us. We reached Fort Bridger late in the month. The fort was no fort at all, just a pair of cabins and a crude corral. Hastings himself was gone, having left a note nailed to a post. "Take the new route. Meet me in the Salt Lake Valley." James Reed read the message aloud, and silence followed. The shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff, would take us through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Desert, bypassing Fort Hall and the longer Oregon Trail. A few families chose to remain behind or rejoin the main route, but most of us, driven by Reed's conviction and our own desire to reach California before the fall rains, pushed on. The Wasatch was a maze of steep canyons and tangled forests. We spent weeks forging a road where none existed. Men chopped through thickets of oak and pine, their arms red with insect bites and sap. Wagons were dismantled and lowered with ropes. Axles snapped, tempers frayed. "We're making miles," Reed insisted, wiping sweat from his brow. "We're making history." But some began to doubt. My mother whispered it first one night, her hands trembling over the cook fire. "We are not on a trail," she said. "We are cutting into the wilderness, and the wilderness does not welcome us." Others began to echo the sentiment. Tamsin Donner recorded the grueling progress in her journal. She noted the lack of water, the death of oxen, the waning morale. We encountered one of Hastings's riders days later, a nervous young man named Bryant, who urged us to reconsider, but it was too late to turn back. Too much effort had gone into blazing the way, and Reed's pride could not stomach retreat. "We press forward," he declared. We left the Wasatch behind, battered and thinned. The sun was hotter now, the sky wider. The silence had changed. It pressed in on us. We could no longer hear the birds, so ahead waited the Great Salt Desert, The land had begun to resist us. The land would not let go. August 1846. The desert seemed to stretch forever, an ocean of salt and silence that shimmered under a sky as white and vast as bone. This was the Great Basin, they told us, a place where water vanished into the earth, and sound had nowhere to echo. We had emerged battered from the Wasatch, but the worst was yet ahead. Every morning brought a bleached horizon and the taste of dust. The sun rose hard and fast, climbing to an unrelenting glare. Salt crystals crusted the edges of the trail like frost. Wagons creaked as they dragged through sand and cracked earth. Animals stumbled. Men sweated through their shirts before noon. The salt flats weren't merely dry, they were cruel. Hooves cut through the brittle crust and sank into mud slick as grease beneath. The oxen bellowed, their legs mired. Children wept for water we didn't have. The air wavered, rippling with heat, mirages that offered false hope. Shimmering lakes that vanished as we drew near. Cool green trees that dissolved into scrub. One day stretched into another with no relief. We rationed water with exacting care. Every drop counted. Lips cracked, tongues swelled. Blisters rose on sunburned skin. Still, the wagons moved, inch by inch, hour by hour. Each mile cost more. James Reed pushed ahead with a manic energy, his pride refusing to falter even as his animals dropped from thirst. His fine wagon, the Pioneer Palace car, was stripped of weight, its contents scattered across the trail. Others followed suit. Trinkets, books, even heirlooms were discarded to lighten the load. "Leave it," Father said, pulling my hand from a small box of carved toys. "We need the space and the strength." "But Grandpa made these," I protested. His eyes softened. "And he'd want you to live more than he'd want you to carry memories." I left them on the trail. The salt wind picked up and buried them quickly. Some nights we camped under a black vault of sky pierced by stars so bright they seemed cruel in their beauty. Coyotes howled from somewhere far beyond our circle of firelight. The fires grew smaller now. Wood was scarce. We burned dried sagebrush and wagon planks. Mother sat with her shawl pulled tight, staring at the embers. Her voice, once soft and melodic, had grown hoarse. "What kind of land is this," she whispered, "that kills without lifting a hand?" Father did not answer. His hands were raw from the rains. He knelt beside her and pressed his forehead to hers, and for a moment, they just breathed together. The mountains still waited, and the snow had already begun to fall in the high passes. We had crossed the basin, but the price was only beginning to show. We had lost cattle. We had lost wagons. We had lost one another. And somewhere along the way, we had started to lose hope. August 1846. The Great Basin behind us, the terrain changed. Less brutal, but no more forgiving. Rolling sagebrush hills gave way to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, and though the land no longer cracked beneath our feet like salt-bleached parchment, a new hardship took root: division. Tempers frayed where canvas once fluttered in harmony. A wheel broken in the dust or an ox that collapsed could ignite arguments that simmered into grudges. The desert had emptied us. The mountains would turn us against each other. It began with a wagon. Louis Keseberg, a Prussian immigrant with a proud streak and dark moods, had stopped to repair a cracked axle. Reed advised him to move off the main trail. "You'll block the entire company," Reed warned. Keseberg squinted beneath his slouch hat, hammer raised. "Then ride around. I didn't ask for your opinion." The exchange was brief, but sharp enough that others took notice. William Eddy muttered something under his breath. Margaret Reed tightened her shawl. Children fell silent, watching with wide eyes. It was the first public fracture in the unity we had carried from independence. Others followed. Food grew scarce. Water became harder to find. We had lost more cattle than expected. Every death, of an ox, of a companion, was felt like a warning. "My son is sick," said Lavina Murphy one morning, cradling little Lemuel. "He can't keep anything down." Mother offered what she could, dried apples and a little cornmeal, but we were already stretching the stores. Then came the Graves family dispute. Their eldest son, Franklin, had begun hoarding supplies, fearing the worst. His sister Mary accused him of keeping more than his share. "We agreed on equal rations," she hissed one night. "What makes your hunger greater than ours?" Franklin did not respond. He simply walked into the night with his rifle, muttering to himself. That was the first time we heard someone mention splitting off from the main group. George Donner tried to calm the gathering tempers. At night, he and Tamsin would invite the heads of families to share coffee around their fire. "We've come this far," George said in his deep, gravelly voice. "Now is not the time to fray." But even he looked tired. Jacob's hands were blistered from hauling harness and rope. Tamsin's journal had become less hopeful, more mathematical. Lists of names, of weights, of distances. "Hope," she wrote in one entry, "has become a calculation." And then came the incident with John Snyder. It happened fast. A disagreement over whose oxen had the right of way escalated to shouting. Snyder, young and strong and full of fury, raised his whip at James Reed. Reed, pushed too far, struck back. A knife flashed. Snyder fell. Blood pooled in the dirt. Screams followed. Patty Reed wept uncontrollably. Reed stood over the body, stunned. He was not arrested, but the company, already strained, decided on exile. Reed was forced to ride ahead, alone, toward Sutter's Fort. He kissed his wife and daughter goodbye. "I'll send help," he promised. "I swear it." And then he rode into the trees, a solitary figure swallowed by the darkening woods. That night, the silence was heavier than any before. We no longer spoke of California. We no longer spoke of gold, or orchards, or land. We spoke of distance, of food, of snow. And still, the mountains waited. October 1846. By early October, the forest thickened, and the terrain took on a new character. Pines grew closer together, their dark needles drinking light. The air sharpened. Morning mists lingered past noon. Somewhere ahead, the Sierra Nevada rose, hidden by cloud and distance. Their weight already pressed against us. The wagons crawled along uneven paths, littered with pine cones, fallen branches, and the skeletal remains of deer. George Donner's team slowed to a crawl after an axle split on a rocky incline. It took 3 men and half a day to mend it. Every delay cost us daylight, and now the daylight itself came shorter. "We should have been over the pass by now," said William Eddy, walking beside his oxen with a hand on the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Another week, maybe 2, and the snows will close it." Others nodded grimly. We all knew what the rumors said. Once snow sealed the Sierra, the road was lost until spring. Tamsin Donner passed her fingers over the frost on the wagon bench each morning, watching it melt beneath her touch. "The trees know," she whispered. "They're bracing." We pushed harder. Days began before sunup. Meals were dry and hurried. Children dozed in wagons and woke crying with cold feet. Anxieties turned to anger more quickly now. Fires sparked over petty grievances, a missing blanket, a spoiled bag of beans. Then came the first flakes. It was late afternoon. We were somewhere near Truckee Lake, though we didn't yet know the name. The sky grew heavy, and the light dimmed, as though the day had given up early. And then the snow came. Not a storm, but a warning. Rachel held her hands out and giggled, like ash from heaven. Mother did not smile. By nightfall, the flakes thickened. George Donner ordered the wagons into a circle. Fires were built high. Children bundled in everything we had. Men chopped wood until their hands blistered. "We'll press through the pass at first light," said William Pike. "There's still time." But the snow was faster. Morning brought white silence. The trail had vanished. Trees bowed beneath drifts. Some of the oxen had broken loose during the night, frightened by wolves perhaps, or cold beyond bearing. A scouting party tried to ascend the pass. They returned by dusk, their faces drawn. "It's sealed," said Eddy. "Snow chest deep, no way over." That night, the wind screamed through the pines. It tore through the canvas of the wagons and found every gap in our clothing. Babies would not stop crying. Men cursed or prayed, but each day brought more snow. We felled trees and built cabins, rough walls, dirt floors, pine needles in every corner. It wasn't shelter, it was survival. The land had claimed us, not as settlers, not as travelers, as prisoners. The first ox was slaughtered within the week, then the second. We kept a tally. Hope faded like sunlight behind storm clouds. California was only miles away, but it may as well have been another world. November 1846. Snow fell in sheets, draping the forest in silence. Time blurred. We measured the days by how often we ate and how long the children could sleep before waking in pain. Candles burned low. Firewood became precious as meat. Our world had narrowed to the dark interiors of cabins built from desperation. Then someone said it. We must go for help. It was Charles Stanton who voiced what many feared. He had returned weeks earlier with mules and some rations from Sutter's Fort, but those gifts were long gone. The realization spread like cold through bone. We would not survive the winter without aid. They won't all make it, George Donner said one night, voice barely above the crackle of his meager fire. His hand shook from fever. Tamsin, kneeling beside him, pressed a cloth to his brow. But some might, and that's what matters. So they gathered, 15 strong, men and women alike. Some volunteered, others were chosen. They would become known as the Forlorn Hope, William Eddy, Charles Stanton, the Graves sisters, Mary and Sarah, the two Indian guides, Luis and Salvador, sent by Sutter. They bound their feet in rags, fashioned snowshoes from oxhide and willow, and carried strips of dried meat that would not last a week. Mother cried silently as she embraced Stanton. "Don't let them die for nothing," she whispered. He nodded, his blue eyes hollow, but resolute. "We'll bring back help, or we won't return at all." They left on a still morning beneath a sky scraped clean by wind. The others stood watching, too weak to cheer, too afraid to weep. The party disappeared into the drifts, their bodies dwarfed by the endless white. Days passed. 1, 2, 5. Food dwindled. We began boiling hides, scraping pine bark. Children's stomachs swelled with hunger. George Donner could no longer rise from his bed of spruce boughs. Tamsin cared for him by candlelight, her journal now filled with inventory. Nails, beans, the number of bullets left. Then a whisper returned, with the wind. "They're dying." A boy, part of the Graves family, had followed their trail and returned early. His face was blue with cold. His words came broken. They couldn't go on. Stanton, he gave his food to the girls, fell behind. Frozen. Some ate the leather from their shoes. Mother turned away. Rumors thickened like smoke. Some said they had begun to eat the dead. Others said the snowshoes failed, and one by one, they collapsed. Patty asked one night, "Will Papa find them?" Margaret Reed answered only with silence. Inside those cabins, our world narrowed further. Death visited quietly, sometimes in the night, sometimes in the hush before dawn. Babies stopped crying. Mothers stared at their hands, no longer knowing what to do with them. But in that darkness, fire still flickered. Tamsin wrote. Eddie's wife Eleanor whispered stories to the children. A lullaby hummed through cracked lips. We waited, not for spring, but for anything. And out in the wilderness, the forlorn hope moved through snow and memory and hunger, chasing salvation one labored step at a time. December 1846. The storm did not relent. Snow piled against the cabin doors, muting sound and light alike. Even the wind seemed tired now, howling only in brief sighs through the trees. We marked the days by candle stubs and hunger pangs. Inside the cabins, the smell of damp pine and smoke had become constant. Children lay beneath piles of rags and furs, their eyes sunken. Few spoke. When they did, it was only in whispers. "Has the snow stopped?" Mary Graves asked one morning, voice hoarse. Her mother only shook her head. That week, the last of the ox hides were used up. We boiled them into a bitter gelatin. Once even that was gone, we turned to mice, pine bark, and blankets. Margaret Reed tore up her own petticoat for cordage, binding up cracked shoes and makeshift snowshoes. She worked silently, her jaw clenched. Only when she thought no one could hear did she murmur prayers. George Donner, delirious with fever, spoke aloud to his long-dead brother. Tamsin read to him from a pocket Bible, her voice shaking but steady. "There is a valley where the wildflowers grow," she whispered, "and it waits for us still." But no one believed it now. The younger children stopped asking questions. Eliza Donner's voice, once shrill with laughter, grew small and listless. "I don't dream anymore," she told Mother one night, "not even pretend ones." On Christmas Eve, the wind picked up again. Snow hissed down from the branches, like the forest itself was shedding tears. That night, a boy from the Breen family passed quietly in his sleep. The next morning, his mother wrapped him in the last wool blanket. "We'll bury him when the ground softens," someone said, but no one moved. The fire sputtered. Someone added a piece of wagon board to the coals. The smell of sap and old paint filled the air. Then, on the third morning after Christmas, we heard a sound that did not belong. Voices. Eddie. He returned ragged, bearded, barely alive. He collapsed at the edge of the Breen's cabin and cried for water. He brought with him news and salvation. They made it. Some of us made it. To the other side. I found help. His wife sobbed as she held him. Others gathered around him like moths to flame. He spoke of horrors, how only 7 of the 15 had survived the crossing, of how they had eaten the dead, of how Luis and Salvador had been murdered for meat. "We're beasts," he wept, "but we lived." And more importantly, he brought word. A relief party would come. Men from California, with food, with blankets. Not everyone believed him. Not everyone could. After weeks of starvation, even hope could feel like a trick. But in the days that followed, the sky lightened, just slightly. The wind lessened. The storms paused. Mother lit a new candle from a stub. The flame fluttered, then steadied. Outside, for the first time in weeks, we heard birds. Not a spring, not yet, but something stirring, something possible, and we waited. Again. February 1847. The sound of voices returned, not the hallucinations of hunger, but real men calling through the trees. When they appeared at the edge of the clearing, the world seemed to tilt. Their boots crunched over ice-packed snow, sun glinting off their rifles and bedrolls. They were lean, hardened, wrapped in fur and hide. Their breath smoked in the cold air, their eyes wide with disbelief at the scene before them. It was James Reed who led them. Months earlier, he'd been cast out after the killing of John Snyder. Now he stood again among us, gaunt but unbroken. He fell to his knees before his wife. "Margaret," he whispered, tears cutting clean trails through his dirt-covered cheeks. "I came back." She held him fiercely, not as a criminal returned, but as a husband, risen from the grave. The rescuers brought flour, beans, salted pork, and blankets. It was not enough for all, but it was something. For many, even chewing had become difficult, our jaws unaccustomed to food. Some vomited, others wept. William Eddy, weaker than ever, pointed to where the dead lay buried in shallow snow. "You must hurry. The past won't hold much longer." The relief party began to divide the camp. Those strongest would leave with them. The rest would remain until another party could arrive. Cries broke out as families were torn in two. "I'm not leaving my sister," Mary Graves screamed. "You can't make me." But the guides were firm. Only those who could walk the trail would be taken. Those too weak would have to wait. Mother tried to stand. Her legs failed beneath her. She kissed Patty and Eliza and sent them with the rescuers, her voice trembling. "You go to Light. I'll follow soon." Others chose to stay. Tamsin Donner would not leave her husband's side. George lay fevered, too ill to lift his head. She shook hands with Reed, her eyes glassy. "Save the children, if you can." And so, one group set out. They moved like ghosts among the pines, each step a triumph of will over the weariness of winter. Children clung to rescuers. Men carried bundles and babies. They left behind a silence louder than any storm. Back at the lake, those who remained turned their attention to survival once more. But now, there was a crack in the darkness, proof that the outside world had not forgotten them, that rescue was real. Inside the Breen's cabin, someone sang. The notes were thin, wavery, but unmistakable. A hymn, rising into the rafters. Others joined in, weak voices, cracked voices, but together. And outside, in the high passes, the relief party marched toward California. Spring still lay far beyond the snow, but we had seen the shape of it. March 1847. The snow melted slowly, as if reluctant to release the dead. Days lengthened, but spring did not yet arrive. The mountains remained silent, entombing the past in wind and shadow. In that twilight of winter, Tamsin Donner kept watch. George had grown quieter, slipping in and out of fevered dreams. His eyes followed her as she moved about the cabin, feeding the fire, tending the scraps of meat she had hidden from the others. She rarely spoke anymore. Her journal, once a lifeline of thought and faith, now lay untouched. Each morning, she walked from the Donners' camp toward the main lake cabins, checking for news. There were signs the second relief might come soon, but snow still blocked the trail, and time, for George, was thinning. Tamsin met with the Breens, with Margaret Reed. She shared her rations with children too weak to cry. She bartered buttons and scraps of linen for firewood. And still, she returned each evening to her husband. "I cannot leave him," she told Margaret one night. "Not now. Not when he needs someone to remember who he was." Margaret didn't argue. There were too few words left in any of them. On the third Sunday of March, the second relief arrived. Fewer than expected, weathered, exhausted, but they brought food and news. More help would come, but slowly. Reed, traveling with them again, embraced his remaining children. Tamsin stood apart, her cloak drawn tightly around her. When they offered to carry her out, she shook her head. "I'll wait. I must." The rescuers left again, taking more children, more survivors. They passed over the high ridges toward Bear Valley, their shapes swallowed by snow-covered trees. Those left behind settled into silence once again. In April, the third relief party came, fewer still, and late. The mountains had claimed too much. What they found at the lake was a tableau of ruin, corpses left in the snow, cabins torn apart for firewood, children listless and wild-eyed. Tamsin was not among them. They followed the path to the Donners' camp. There, in the low shelter of trees and snow-matted pines, they found George's body, half covered, hands clasped on his chest, and they found her journal beside him, a single page, dated days earlier. "He is gone. I must try the pass. If I do not return, I go not for myself, but for the children. Pray they are safe." She had gone alone. Later, they would learn she had reached the Miwok guides at a way station near Johnson's ranch, but it was too late. She died the next morning. James Reed stood in silence as he heard the tale. The snow fell again that night, light, soft, indifferent. Tamsin Donner's vigil had ended, but her legacy, like the frozen lake and shattered wagons, remained etched into the heart of the mountains. April 1847. The final relief arrived to find a silence that felt sacred. Snow draped the stumps of shattered cabins, burying the past inch by inch. Footprints from those who had gone ahead had already begun to fill in. There were only a handful left to rescue. They moved through the clearing with reverence. Charles Covalode, one of the Miwok guides, led them past the wreckage. He had seen the worst of the mountains before, but not like this. "They held on," he murmured, shaking his head. "God help them. They held on." The Breens were among the last still living. Patrick Breen sat outside his shelter, wrapped in a patchwork of blankets and animal skins, reading slowly from his tattered Bible. His beard had grown thick and wild, his voice low as he recited psalms. "You're here at last," he said when the rescuers approached. "Thought perhaps we'd become shadows." The children barely reacted. They were too weak, too used to suffering. Some stared in silence, Others flinched at movement. Those old enough to understand what rescue meant burst into tears that wouldn't stop. What followed was quiet, methodical, distributing the last rations, bandaging frostbitten limbs, preparing stretchers for those who could not walk. The living were few, the dead were many. In one cabin, they found the skeletal remains of Foster's cousins, half buried in snow and soot. In another, bones had been cleaned and stacked like kindling. The truth was plain, unspoken. Hunger had outlasted mercy. James Reed walked among them all with hollow eyes. He tried to match names to faces, but some were beyond recognition. He found one of his own wagons split open, the iron stove wrenched free. Its metal had been used to cook flesh. Still, there were miracles. Patty Reed, just 8 years old, clung to her father's coat as if it were the only solid thing in the world. She had survived. Eliza Donner, pale but breathing. Virginia Reed, barely able to walk, but smiling when she saw him. "Papa," she whispered, "you came back again." He lifted her into his arms and sobbed. The group turned toward the pass. Though the snow was shallower now, the way remained treacherous. They carried those too frail to walk, propping others with poles or makeshift crutches. The silence of death lingered behind them, pressing like a second shadow. As they crossed out of the basin for the final time, no one looked back. Weeks later, newspapers in California and the East would print stories of what happened in the Sierra Nevada. Some called it tragedy. Others called it savagery. They argued over blame, over choices. But they could never understand the cold. Only those who walked out of those mountains knew what they had left behind. May 1847. The trail down from the mountains was littered with ghosts, markers of loss carved not into wood, but into memory. The final party, ragged and malnourished, inched toward the Central Valley. Every mile brought warmer air, but no true relief. For the survivors, survival had become its own torment. The snow thinned into patches, pine gave way to oak. The sound of running water returned to the land, and yet their bodies could not forget the cold. Virginia Reed walked beside her father, her gait unsteady but improving with each mile. "Will people know?" she asked one evening, when the fire crackled in a ring of stones and the Miwok guides cooked rice over a small flame. James looked at her. "They'll know some of it." "Will they hate us?" "No." He shook his head slowly. "Some will pity, some won't believe. But you lived, Virginia. That matters most." Further behind them, the Breens trudged silently. Margaret Breen held her youngest child on her back, whispering to him in Gaelic. The words meant nothing to the rest, but they held rhythm, safety, some thread to the life that had come before. As the land grew greener, the bodies grew frailer. Starvation did not loosen its grip easily. Most had frostbite. All had lost someone, few spoke unless spoken to. The Miwok guides watched with quiet wariness. They had seen what hunger could do. On the 6th day, the group crested a low ridge and saw, for the first time in many months, open pasture. Brown hills rolling toward the Sacramento Valley, dotted with wildflowers and cattle. One of the children cried out. "Home?" she asked. No one answered. But some wept. Others fell to their knees and pressed their palms into the earth. At Johnson's ranch, the settlers came running. Some had heard stories already. Others stood in silence as the party arrived, barefoot, ragged, sunken-eyed. They looked like survivors of a distant war. Doctors were summoned, beds prepared. The survivors were fed slowly, broth, soft bread, thin rice porridge, and still many could not eat. Their bodies rejected food as if it were foreign. James Reed stayed by his daughters as they slept. At the end of the row, little Patty Reed kept clutching a locket in her fist, refusing to let it go. One woman, a settler's wife, asked Reed, "How did they make it?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out across the flat fields to where the sun was sinking. "They didn't," he said. "Not all of them." Epilogue: The Survivor's Burden, years later. San Jose, California. Spring 1871. Virginia Reed sat alone on the veranda of her family's modest home, now a matron in her 40s. The late afternoon sun stretched across the orchard in gold and rose, and the heady scent of orange blossoms drifted through the warm breeze. It was a day that should have promised nothing but peace, but the mountains were never far. Her gray-streaked braid rested over one shoulder as she traced the edge of a leather-bound journal, one she had begun as a girl of 12, still naive to the kind of hunger that had no name. The pages had softened over the decades, yellowed and curled, the ink faded in places by time and tears. Within those worn leaves lay memories no fire could erase, no retelling could simplify. She opened it and turned a few pages, stopping at a half-finished entry. We camped beneath the pines, snow still falling. Papa said we must hold fast. Mama sang as she sewed. My fingers bled, that was all. She had written it in December, 1846. Her fingers trembled slightly as she closed the book. Journalists came occasionally, historians too, eager for the truth, or for something more sensational. Most wanted to know about the starvation, the cannibalism. They never asked about the silence that followed, the emptiness left behind when grief hollowed out the heart. Some people believed the survivors had been marked. Others whispered rumors. There were even poems written about them. Gruesome, prurient things. Virginia never corrected the worst of the stories, but she didn't confirm them either. There was a power in silence, and sometimes silence was the only thing one could give. That spring the garden had come early. The lavender bloomed in neat rows beside rosemary bushes, and the fig tree, planted the year she and Edwin married, spread its thick green leaves in welcome shade. She bent to pluck a weed from the garden bed and noticed the small cross she had placed near the stone wall. Her hand brushed the inscription carved in her own script, "For the ones who waited." She knelt there, resting her hand on the warm earth. In her mind, she was back in the pass. Snow taller than the wagons. The sound of wind howling through the broken pine. The dry crackle of bark burning in a makeshift hearth. The low whimper of a child starving in their sleep. She remembered Tamsin Donner's face, not in horror, but in dignity. Tamsin had chosen to stay behind, to die beside her husband, rather than seek her own rescue. She had tended the sick until there was no one left to tend. In 1854, Virginia had spoken at the dedication of the new monument at Truckee Lake. She had stood before a crowd of settlers, prospectors, and dignitaries, her voice unsteady, but her resolve firm. "We are not here because we survived," she had said, "but because others stayed behind so that we might." After the ceremony, she and the remaining survivors, what few were able to attend, stood in a circle around the stone memorial. No one spoke for a long time. James Reed had gripped her shoulder and whispered, "That was well said, daughter." Reed had died just last year. She missed him terribly. His belief in their survival, even from afar, had driven the rescue. And yet, he had carried a guilt no accolades could erase. "I live because I left," he once confessed to her in a letter, and I still wonder if that was right. She kept that letter in a drawer by her bed. She had read it so many times she could recite its closing line. "Tell them we were human, that we feared and hoped and endured. Tell them we did not die as monsters." She had tried. She was still trying. Across the yard, her grandson Jacob ran beneath the trees, a boy of 10 with a head full of wild curls and a thirst for stories. He was always asking questions, curious beyond his years. He rushed up the steps now, breathless. "Grandmama," he said, eyes wide, "did you really eat tree bark to stay alive?" She smiled faintly, not startled by the question. "Yes," she said, "and once we boiled strips of leather from the wagon harness." "Did it taste awful?" "Worse than awful," she said. "But when you are starving, your body stops caring about taste." "Did you cry a lot?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Sometimes, but not as much as you might think. Hunger dries tears." He was quiet for a moment. "I would have helped you. I would have found food." She touched his cheek. "I know you would have. That's why I tell the story." He ran off again, satisfied for the moment, chasing shadows with a stick-turned sword. Virginia watched him go. In him, she saw the continuation of something she never thought she'd live long enough to see. Peace. Inside the house, Edwin emerged, blinking against the light. He brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her, his hand resting gently over hers. "I saw the boy pestering you again," he said with a wry smile. "He has a good heart," she said, "and a sharp tongue. He gets both from you." She chuckled softly. "Do you remember when we met? You threatened to strike me with a skillet. I did not. You did. I was offering to fix your wagon wheel, and you thought I was trying to cheat you." She laughed outright. "Well, you were." They sat in comfortable silence. The sun lowered. Doves cooed from the trees. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly. She turned to him. "Regret what?" "Talking about it, keeping the journal, letting the world know." "No." She looked out across the fields. "They need to know what it cost. Not gold, not land, but the people it claimed. The souls who never left the mountains. The price of a dream, paid in flesh and fire." In recent years, a young woman named Eliza Donner had published her own memoir. It had been well received. Virginians had written her a letter of congratulations, and Eliza replied with gratitude. She was one of the few who understood the weight they carried. And Patty Reed, still lively despite age, had become a teacher. She had dedicated her life to children, perhaps because she had watched so many die too young. They were not just survivors, they were stewards of memory. As twilight deepened, Virginia lit a lamp and opened the journal once more. She wrote a final line in ink, darker than the others. "We were not lost. We were changed." The wind stirred the branches. Somewhere, a nightbird called. She closed the book and held it against her chest. She would not be remembered only as a girl who endured horror, but as a woman who bore witness. The past had not broken her. It had carved her into something enduring, etched by wind and cold, by silence and sacrifice. And so she remembered, and so she endured.
Mountains whisper. In winter's grip we faced the night, a world of shadows, cold and tight, beneath the icy silent stare. We fought for breath, for life, for air. The mountain's shadow cast its weight, a test of faith, a cruel fate, but hearts beat on, resilient, strong, a whispered hope, a fading song. From snow and dark, new life will bloom, a dawn that banishes the gloom. With every sunrise, hope is reborn, a promise whispered with the dawn. We carry scars, both deep and wide, yet in our souls, a stubborn pride. For in the coldest, darkest hours, the human spirit's finest powers. So let the mountains stand in silence. We've faced the storm, endured the violence, and in their shadows we will grow. A shining light begins to glow. Thank you for listening. For more great audiobooks, please like, share, and subscribe.